So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for this week's CS Research Seminar. Today we have Professor David Guy Brizan, who is going to be presenting. I'm going to give a brief introduction and then I'll hand it over to Professor Brizan. So Dr. Brizan is an assistant professor here in the CS department. Prior to joining USF, he was a research assistant in the speech lab at Queens College and an instructor at Hunter College. He has previously worked for the City of New York, IBM, United Healthcare, as well as other public and private institutions. Professor Brizan holds a PhD in computer science from the Graduate Center, City University of New York. His research interests are natural language processing, machine learning, and databases, specifically on the personal and cultural demographic information transmitted during speech and typing. This research may lead to more accurate speech recognition systems, and today Professor Brizan will be discussing his research on determining and processing speech dialects. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Professor Brizan.
Thank you very much. So yes, I am going to be talking about processing speech. And I specifically want to talk about dialects, specifically dialects of English in this case, but it could be any dialect if we apply it properly. So one of the things, speech research really, or speech systems really began in 1952. And they were really primitive at that point in time. They could recognize, maybe 10 digits. So I can, speak into a microphone, say like, 153 or something, and it would recognize that. So we have come a long way since then, of course. We've got, call centers and, it's often hard for us to do, not hard, but it's often, it often takes a little bit of effort for us to distinguish between whether we're speaking to a human or whether we're speaking to a machine. They have become that good, generally speaking, unless, of course, you happen to be of some speech demographic type that doesn't have a good training set. In other words, if you've got any kind of regional dialect, second language, dialect, if you speak slightly differently, etc. Something that people haven't really taken a beat on is also the speech of elderly people or the speech of very young people like children. Oftentimes, if we don't fall into sort of a very narrow window of age and birthplace and language and so on, our speech systems often often perform really poorly on our speech. I want to play you an example. I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. This example was actually it existed in a real database of speech samples. And it was reenacted by a friend of mine, Sin An, because I didn't have a license, I didn't have permission to use the speech samples from this database. But he recreated it accurately, and the results that I'm about to show you are exactly correct. So what I'd like to do is play you a speech sample and ask you what you hear. And feel free to speak up at any point while I'm speaking. There's also, I've got the chat window open, so feel free to chat me what you're hearing or whatever. So this first speech sample is a little bit long. There are a total of 3 of them. The first one is a little bit long, so you have to wait about, I would say about 10 seconds to hear the whole thing. But bear with me, listen to it, and let me know what you're hearing.
What is the name of the movie in which Nicolas Cage won the Oscar?
Okay, so what did you hear? No one heard anything.
What was the name of the movie with Nicolas Cage where he won the Oscar?
Exactly.
I'll respond.
Yeah, close enough. What is the name of the movie in which Nicolas Cage won the Oscar? So our speech system, like we played the sample, our speech system heard it, we heard it, we had no problem with that particular speech sample. The next one, however, I'm going to show you what the, I'm going to play, there are a couple of errors I'm telling you right now. I'm going to play you the speech sample. I'm going to ask you what you heard, and I'm going to tell you what the system recognized. Okay, here we go.
Dr. Chisago.
Okay, so what did you, sorry? All right, I'm going to start calling on people because no one's saying anything. Jenny, what did you hear?
Can you play again? I actually didn't catch it.
Okay, let's see.
What is the name
Oops,
of the movie
wrong one.
in which Nicolas Cage won the Oscar?
Okay, this one.
Dr. Chisago.
I can hear author Chisago.
Anyone else? So
sounded like I heard doctor something.
He said doctor something, that's right. And Jenny was also right, he said Chisago. So what he was saying was Dr. I can't say it now, Dr. Zhivago. And what our ASR system, what our speech recognition system heard was Dr. Chisago, which is kind of, it makes sense. He actually pronounced those words. And from the chat, I see Zhivago, the movie. Yes, he's talking about the movie Dr. Zhivago, famous movie from the 60s. I don't know, before I was born. All right, one more. Tell me what you hear, and I'll tell you what the speech system heard.
Pink Panther movies.
Okay, so what did you hear? Alexi, I'm going to pick on you. What did you hear? One person said ink pencil movies.
I heard something very similar to that.
Okay. So what he actually was saying was Pink Panther movies. And what the system heard was Pimp Anthea movies. So this is kind of failing for me. And I think maybe we're having a little problem with, when we do this live, when we do this in person, we almost never have someone mishear what my friend said. So they always hear, Pink Panther movies. They always hear Dr. Zhivago. I think there may be some error in terms of the medium that we're in. Zoom is not our friend right now. So the first error is understandable. The second error is a problem, I think, and it's not necessarily a problem because it's funny, but it's a huge problem because the Pink Panther is a comic book. It's a comic from the 70s, 60s, 70s. I don't remember, and it's kind of fun. And children might start watching it. And if we're actually speaking to some sort of speech recognition system, that's a front for playing movies. Playing movies about pimps may not, be the right thing to do. So, we have to be a little bit careful about, what we're doing and what our speech systems are hearing and why. And that's kind of the point I'm making. Our speech systems all struggle because of foreign accents, what we call L2, second language accents. And they fail because of how they're built. Generally speaking, this is the architecture that they're built on. And what we do is we train these things with, we train these speech systems with a lot of examples of people speaking English. And, if we're, say, like in the United States, we, get a diverse population. We get, people from San Francisco and New York and Chicago and, Miami, and we throw them all into one big training bucket. and we say, here are all your speech samples. And we throw it at our speech system. And our speech system does something really, really, really strange. It learns that the proper way to pronounce, any particular set of words is what's called a central dialect. It learns that, it learns basically the way that newscasters speak in the United States. So if you ever, I'm trying to think of a famous newscaster, like who's current, I used to say Peter Jennings, but my wife said he's too old now. And then I tried to do Matt Lauer, but Matt Lauer. So I don't even know who's left. Famous newscaster, anybody?
Katie Couric?
Katie Couric. The one who I like, I think the best is Leslie Stahl. Even though she's been around since Watergate or whatever. And the reason I like her, I like to talk about her is because she's from a place where you would think her accent would be extremely strong and extremely pronounced. But she has this very sort of flat, neutral sounding American accent. And that neutral sounding American accent is called a central dialect of the United States. It's actually from a particular place, and that particular place is the Chicago suburbs. So if you went out into the Chicago suburbs in say the 1950s, that's the standard accent that's the accent that people sounded. That's the accent that people used, the dialect that people used. And at the time in the 50s, the central dialect of the United States was actually an Atlantic one. It came from somewhere in the East Coast. So people sounded a little bit more stilted, a little bit closer to like an English dialect. And you can see movies from that time, and you can hear the differences in the way they speak. Since then, that central dialect has moved west, and it's currently centered in the Midwest. So if you want to make it in news, you have to sound like you're from that particular place. And maybe in a few years, in a few decades or whatever, that central dialect will move somewhere else. It may shift south, or it may shift west, or it may shift back to the East Coast or something. We don't know. Every language, however, has a central dialect. So in England, the central dialect is, depending upon who you speak to, it's either called received pronunciation, that's the Queen's English, or it's called Standard Southern English, SSE. The central dialect, by the way, for the United States is called Standard American English, or SAE. So compared to that central dialect, every other dialect that we know about, for example, the Southern drawl, every other dialect has what's called a shift in the phone space, meaning that our A's sound a little bit flatter or a little bit rounder. So instead of saying, I parked my car, in Boston, you'd say, I park my car, or something like that. I'm very bad at accents. I try not to do it too much, but I don't mind doing like one or two just for emphasis. So the A's in the Boston dialect, for example, sound a little bit different. And that is called a shift in the phone space. So this is a strange thing that happens with speech systems. We throw a bunch of dialects at them. It learns the central dialect, and adding more speech from a different region does not help. So if we add more and more and more Boston samples to our training samples, it doesn't learn the Boston accent. It still learns the Chicago accent until, of course, there's a tipping point, and then it only learns the Boston accent and then doesn't learn any other one. It's a really strange thing that I don't think anyone has really explained very well, but it's a finding from about 7 years ago by Najafian et al. So how do we as human beings recognize speech? We have no problem, anyone who's listened to enough American English has no problem listening to the Boston dialect and understanding it, and understanding that, what they're saying. Well, we do a couple things. We use what we know about the speaker. So I deliberately said, for example, that the person who was speaking, his name was Guo Zinan. If you know anything about the name, it's actually a Chinese name. So he's from that part of the world. So I was sort of priming you to say, expect an accent at that point in time. We also leave ourselves open to a lot of pronunciation possibilities, right? Now that I know that the person's name is quotes in An, and you know, he may have, his native language may not be English, the next thing that humans normally do is we say, okay, I'm going to take a little bit of extra time to understand what he's saying because it may not sound like my dialect. We may also assume that, especially if someone is not speaking their native language, we may also assume that that person has a restricted lexicon, meaning they're unlikely to say words like onomatopoeia, and more likely to use more common words. And we sort of also determine the competence of the speaker at the same time. So we're expecting a lot of different pronunciation possibilities. We're expecting the person to use a smaller vocabulary usually, and we're sort of priming ourselves, waiting for that to happen. Essentially, all this taken all together, what we're doing is we have one speech model, we have one expectation for how someone is going to speak to us. We're essentially allowing multiple possibilities, multiple violations in our speech model. So anyway, I looked at this specifically. So my friend quotes in his native language is Mandarin. And I did a performance difference between if someone is a native speaker of Mandarin versus if someone is a native speaker of standard American English, what the differences are in performance. So the word accuracy, how many times we recognize the individual words, there's about a 10% performance drop between you know, someone who's speaking English natively and someone who's speaking it as their second language. It's about the same, about a 10% drop also in phrase accuracy. So not just the individual words that are spoken, but the entire sentence or the entire speech sample that's being spoken. So I care about this because, not because I speak a second language, I do speak you know, a bunch of other languages, but I care about this because I don't have the American accent. Some of you already know, I grew up in the country of Trinidad and Tobago, specifically on the island of Trinidad, and it's got a history that goes back a couple hundred years. So just before, you know, in the late 1400s, Columbus actually landed in Trinidad, and he discovered it and named Trinidad actually on his third voyage. He named it for the Holy Trinity because there are 3 mountain ranges. So he landed in Trinidad, named it, and the Spanish controlled Trinidad from, you know, for the next like 250 years, give or take. And you know, they sent people there, and all the people died, and they sent more people, and you know, there was disease, and you know, the native population didn't exactly, you know, like the Spanish there, et cetera, et cetera. They tried, and they were never able to increase the population of you know, non-native Trinidadians. And then, of course, the Spanish decided to unleash their secret weapon, which was the Catholic Church. So they essentially granted a lot of land to anyone who was Catholic. And the people who took advantage of that were, strangely enough, not the Spanish, they were the French. So French planters, especially from other parts of the Caribbean, like Martinique, they showed up and they took advantage of the land grant, and they started planting, you know, cocoa. Which became, you know, raw ingredients for chocolate and so on. And the population started taking off. And then, you know, that went on for about, you know, 25, 35 years, give or take. And then one day the British decided, hey, we would like Trinidad. And so they sailed into the main port in Trinidad, and they took over in a completely bloodless, you know, war. It just essentially walked into Trinidad one day and said, we now own it. And the Spanish were like, all right, fine. And the French were like, can we still plant? And they were like, yeah, sure. And everyone was cool with the whole situation. About less than 50 years after that, the British abolished slavery everywhere in all of the colonies. And something then happened in Trinidad that I think didn't happen anywhere else in the Caribbean. The enslaved population just refused to go back into the fields and work them. They just said, there's a famous phrase from then, people were speaking French, and the famous phrase was pas de 6 ans, no more of that 6-year nonsense. And what that means is essentially the planters, the owners of the fields and so on, wanted to have sort of like indentured servitude or whatever for 6 years after slavery. And by and large, the formerly enslaved population revolted and said that they would not do that. And so the British especially, but other colonists, looked around for laborers from different places. They tried to import laborers from China, from Madeira, which is a Portuguese colony. They tried to import people from those places, and all of those generally failed. Until about 10 years or so later, the first laborers from India arrived in Trinidad. And those people, the ethnic Indian population, were very successful in terms of working on fields and bringing Trinidad to the place where it was economically before slavery. And as you can see, there's a blue line over here, and that's actually the population of Trinidad throughout time. So the population increased from then on, through the 1900s, and this is, I think, at the year 2000. So the actual population is a little bit higher now in 2020. I think there are about 1.3 million Trinidadians. We're taking over. So that's a little bit of a history of Trinidad, and it kind of explains why Trinidad sounds the way it does, or Trinidadian language sounds the way it does. So we speak English officially, but we have words that come from not just English, but also other parts of Western Europe. So Trinidadians never go to parties, for example. We only ever go to fêtes. A fête, of course, is a French word for party. And we never say, like, to our loved ones, honey, or sweetie, or something like that. We say doudou. Do is sweet in French. So we have all of these like French words that are built into our language. We also have words that are clearly West African. So callaloo is a dish. It's a food that we eat, and that word is clearly a West African word. There's a specific dish that I believe comes from Angola that is very close to our callaloo. It's almost exactly the same. Trinidadians never like hang out. We make lahe. Lahe is a place where grain goes to dry. It's just hanging out, doing nothing. We also have words from South India, a lot of food words, if you can't tell. So kuchela is something to eat. Bhaji is something to eat. Dal, of course, is something to eat. We have a word called dugla. I think that means, if there are any South Asians here, you can maybe tell me. I think dugla means two heads. It's specifically someone of mixed heritage, like ethnically African and ethnically Indian. So we can say, a person is a dugla, meaning a person has two parents of different ethnicities. We also have a very sing-songy accent. I'm not going to do it because, I don't want to sound like I'm making fun of my own people. But if you Google like the Trinidadian accent, you'll get a lot of like jokes and so on about how like I got directions and I ended up dancing to my destination or something like that. And the last is we have this very unique grammar. Like we can use the word does to mean to do something habitually. So the word wasa does give me gripe means that word wasa makes me uncomfortable all the time, habitually. That, by the way, is like the funniest joke in Trinidad, and I know you're not getting it because we're not there in Trinidad. And that's kind of my point. We've got very unique language in Trinidad. It's really meant for Trinidadians, and it's really not meant for people outside of Trinidad. But the fact that we have some unique language in Trinidad is not in and of itself unique. So there was this article on NPR. It's a few years old now. But there was this article on NPR about Ugandan English, and the title was "Don't Bench That Dentist," and I had no idea what it meant. I had to read the entire article, and what it meant. A dentist is someone who is like, you know, digging in your teeth, and you may have gold in your teeth. Benching is to sit down and to speak to someone with romantic intentions. So like, I will speak to someone and, you know, say like, hey, why don't you, you know, like, why don't we get together or something like that. So overall, don't bench that dentist means don't sit down and speak to someone who's only after the gold that you've got, you know, on your person. You know, don't mess with a gold digger, I think is what Americans would say. So like all of that, you know, like if I'm assuming if I'm Ugandan, don't bench that dentist is just shorthand for, you know, like I understand, and it doesn't need any further explanation. Outside of Uganda, however, we need a larger explanation about what that means. And that's just one example. There may be several other examples. This problem is not just in English, so I do speak a little bit of Swedish, and I can tell you that there's a difference between the Swedish spoken in Stockholm versus the Swedish spoken in the south, in the southern region called Skåne. So in Stockholm, we would say, hey, meaning hello. And in Skåne, you would say, hi. So it's spelled the same, it's just pronounced very differently in the southern region. You know, to say, you know, goodbye, you would say, hej då, in Stockholm, and in Skåne, you would say, hej då. And there are many other examples, right? To say thanks a lot, you would say tack så mycket in Stockholm, and in Skåne, you would say tack ska du ha. So there you go. Very different, very different ways of saying the same thing. So how many dialects are there? There have been a lot of studies on this. So I'm showing you two different ones, or for two different countries. One is by Corpora and Pisoni. That's the one on the left, talking about the dialects in the United States, and they claim that there are 9. And they've illustrated these specific 9 ones. There's one everywhere in the West that, you know, from, I don't know where that is. Is that Idaho? I don't know the states. Montana? Wyoming? That's Wyoming, right? Someone tell me where this is.
That's Wyoming.
That's Wyoming. Okay, good. All right. So from Wyoming, you know, from that line of Wyoming west is, you know, we all have the same accent. And then there's a northern one that's Minnesota, Wisconsin, you know, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That's Michigan, right? Yes. Yep. There's a central, there's a southern region. There's Texas apparently has its own, you know, with a little bit of Oklahoma and Louisiana thrown in. Strangely enough, I don't know whether you can tell this, but New York City by itself has its own accent. So it doesn't actually fall into the mid-Atlantic one. Anyway, this is a country, this country has, it's not 400,000 people yet, it's 350, 360, 370, somewhere around there. In a country of that many people, there are 9 dialects according to these folks. In a country as small as Sweden with about 8 million people, there's 6 total dialects, including Swedish that's spoken in other parts of the world, like in Finland. So I found that kind of interesting, and you know, like it gives me a little bit of a scale about how big a dialect could be or how small it could be. I'm not sure I believe this though, and I'll explain why later on. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to look at, I also looked at how well our speech systems process language from people with regional dialects, and you know, determine what the performance was, and it was about as poor as if I were speaking a foreign language, depending upon my dialect. But I want to argue that it's more than just a regional dialect. And there are a couple of folks who, you know, the research is now like, you know, about 10 years old, but there are a lot of folks who have been talking about linguistic differences that are not just accounted by the place someone learned a particular language. So there are, about 10 years ago, USA looked at creaky voice. So people who were saying things like, I really don't want to do that. You know, that creaky voice started being used by college-educated American women. Think, what's her name? Lena Dunham from Girls, right? So these folks started using creaky voice as a way of emphasizing what they were, as a vocal side channel, communicating things with language without using words, more than just their words. There's also this, the French, and it's not just America, right? The French have been overemphasizing words by adding like those very sort of like fricative sounds to their language. So saying like mercredi, instead of saying mercredi, you would say mercredi, something like that. Again, I don't do accents really well. What we find in general, though, is that language varies with age, with gender, with religion, with profession, with ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these variations are not accounted for in the dialects that I showed you before for Sweden, or the dialects I showed you before for the United States, not to mention other parts of the world. So one example, excuse me, one example of that is called cue phrases. So a cue phrase is just a filler phrase. It's just something that doesn't actually provide content. It doesn't actually tell you what the user is thinking. It just acts as a filler. So you can actually say things like, actually, I don't really want to, go to the supermarket today, right? I could take out the word actually from that sentence and it would still mean the same thing. These cue phrases are actually, they have some distribution depending upon the person's demographics. So Wari looked specifically at the distribution of clergy based on gender and found that some people were saying amen more and some people were saying hallelujah a lot more. So one of the questions I had was whether these distributions were different in American English. All right. Overall, what I'm arguing is this. There's something called an idiolect. Idiolect is my personal language, the way I speak, and how that's different from the way everyone else speaks. And of course, there's language, which is an agreed set of words, my lexicon, an agreed set of rules, my grammar, and a distribution, my language model. All of these packaged into one, and in a way that a bunch of people, a country, a set of folks, English speakers, for example, may agree on all of it. Dialect falls somewhere between language and idiolect. Dialect is region. It's based on a particular region. So, a bunch of folks in a particular place agree on one particular set of rules. They pronounce these rules in a certain way, etc. I would argue, though, that somewhere between dialect and idiolect, we'll probably find something interesting. I think that for a number of different reasons. Number one, language changes over time, and what the implication of that is that my daughter, the generation that comes after me, probably has a different set of language compared to me. When I said I grew up in Trinidad, I left Trinidad many decades ago. And when I go back, I'm still a little bit confused because I don't quite understand like the newer terms. Like there's a term I just learned called tabanka, which is like a longing for someone. I've never heard that term when I was growing up there. My language is frozen at the time that I left Trinidad. And we see it as a generational shift as well. People who are older speak in a way that's slightly different to people who are younger. I would argue, in fact, that we shouldn't look at dialect or language. Idiolect is way too small, to model on and too unstable. We maybe should look at something a little bit smaller than language, a little bit smaller than dialect. I would argue that we should model on something I'm calling linguistic subculture. So it's a dialect. It's sort of like the way things sound. It's usually based on a particular region, but it's also word choice. It's also grammar, the rules that I can use to put things together. to put words together to form phrases and sentences. It's a bunch of different things, and it's got a realization on all of those levels. My hypothesis is that a person's linguistic subculture has a number of realizations, including the way it sounds, the specific flatness of my A's, for example, but it also includes the way I string words together, the emphasis that I put on certain words and remove from others, my prosody, the sing-songiness of my voice, for example. It has that realization. It has a realization in vocabulary. So I'm much more likely to use the word, I'm much more likely to use the word lorry rather than truck, which is what we use in America, and also in grammar. So one of the things you may have noticed, I have this, because I speak English on different continents, you may notice that I would say something like different than, different from, different to, and I sort of use them interchangeably. And it depends on what I'm thinking of at the time, which linguistic subculture I'm pulling from at that particular time. My argument is, great, you can identify someone's linguistic subculture. Great parlor trick, right? It's not just that. I want to say that using someone's linguistic subculture, determining it, and then using a model built on that subculture, maybe we can realize some sort of computational advantage in speech and language processing. Maybe if we did that, my speech system would understand Trinidadian English. All right. So there are a bunch of possible applications. We're running a little bit short on time, but I'm going to skip over this. I'm going to say that there's a theory behind what I'm doing. I'm not just doing it willy-nilly. I didn't come up with this by myself. I spoke to a bunch of linguists, and they said, do you know about the obligatory contour principle? And I was like, what's that? And then they were like, do you know about optimality theory? And I was like, what's that? It basically means my native language or my native dialect or my native linguistic subculture determines the combination of sounds that are preferred for my group, my group of people, my speaker group. One example here is it comes from Jamaicans who live in England, some of whom have a lot of interaction with the native English population, and some of whom are very steeped in the Jamaican culture. So this is a phone. This is a sound in human language, and that phone it's the interdental fricative, I think it's called. It's the TH sound. So that TH sound actually predicts. It can predict how much interaction someone has in the English culture. So the more people are, steeped in their Jamaican culture, the less interaction they have with the Brits, the less likely they are to make that sound. That's what Musa and found in his work. This is about 6 years ago. So using that, we can actually predict, we may be able to look at not just that particular sound, but all sounds that humans can make. Look at how much someone produces some sounds or some combinations of sounds, and then based on that, we can determine whether that person belongs to one linguistic subculture or another. That's sort of the basis of what I've done. Oops. That's the basis behind a system called PRLM, that stands for Phone Recognition and Language Modeling. So phone recognition is just listening for particular sounds, and language modeling is, now that we've heard that there's a distribution of that sound, we can literally count that many times, divided by the total number of phones we heard, and then produce a language model, produce a probability that that person is has a lot of interaction with the Jamaican population, or a lot of interaction with the native British population. That's the basis behind the earliest systems in this kind of research, in accent identification or language identification. So this work is, very old. It's like, almost 30 years old now. But it was originally performed to distinguish between Caribbean and South American Spanish. It's since been used to distinguish 4 different types of Arabic and 3 different types of Chinese dialects, etc. And these systems are, quite accurate, even though they're, fairly about 2 generations ago in terms of machine learning. They produce either very low error rates or very high accuracy, depending upon how you measure it. There are a bunch of variants to PRLM, and I'm going to skip in the interest of time, and just say that I looked at 2 different corpora. These corpora are both British, and they took speech samples from different parts of the English islands. So, this one called IVIE, for example, Intonational Variation in English, looked at English spoken in Ireland, Northern Ireland, as well as the Republic of Ireland, and in a bunch of different places in England itself. And I think I thought they were in Wales, but maybe not. This one called ABI, Accents of the British Islands, went into Scotland and definitely went into Wales, among other places. So both of these, in both of these, there were a bunch of speakers from a bunch of different places. They read a bunch of speech. There are a bunch of speech labels on the IVIE corpus, gender and region and a bunch of other things. But they were all by 16-year-old students at the time. So this is, 2001. So they're fully adult by now. ABI did not have as many labels, so the labels were just about where the person was from. So using PRLM, I took these 2 different corpora, threw them into a PRLM system, shook, and found that we can excuse me, we can really easily determine where someone is from with a high degree of accuracy. So our baseline accuracy is it's about 10% or so. All of the systems that we looked at did really well. This is a deep learning system, not particularly well optimized, but it did especially well, about twice as good as the others. And since then, I've actually done a little bit more work with one of the USF graduate students, Kei Fukutani, and he's done, I think, even better than this with a specific type of deep neural network called a CNN. On ABI, we don't do quite as well, but we almost always do above baseline performance. So, excuse me. I also looked at an American corpus called Switchboard. So we divided all of the speech into these 9 regions, like I told you, and didn't look at speech recognition per se. What we were looking at is when someone was born. We were looking at their generation, because we had that as a label. And we did generation by the decade in which someone was born, so not like Generation X versus millennials or boomers or whatever. We were looking at this person was born in the 1950s, this person was born in the 1940s, etc. So we looked at that, and when we did, we found that we were able to predict when someone was born within 10 years, really quite accurately, which was kind of I don't think anyone's done that before. I think it's kind of an interesting result. All right, so sorry. A couple questions. Can we increase the performance of our speech recognition systems by knowing where the region that someone is from? So I looked at those two corpora in England that I was telling you about, ABI and IVIE, and with one model trained on all of this speech, we got some performance, we got some accuracy. So the accuracy is the green bar, and the red part is the error. That's obviously the error, and of course this bar sums to 100. So in Scotland, for example, we got, maybe about, it looks like about 60, 65%. This is in a paper, so I can actually give you the numbers if you care about it. In Belfast, we got lower performance, strangely enough. Our standard Southern English, not surprising, has the highest accuracy. So this one is closest to the central dialect for the English islands. When we looked at building a model specifically for that region, so rather than building it on all of the speech that we've got, I built a specific model for, say, Inner London that just used the training examples from Inner London. So it's a regional dialect. When we do that, we see increases in performance throughout this entire data set. So everywhere we did much better. Okay, so we did the same thing. We repeated this experiment for Switchboard, and we found that we got some performance increases, but not a whole lot. It's a little bit strange that we didn't see that in the US and we saw it in England. Not so surprising, but interesting. But what I did was look at cue phrases. And I looked specifically at the this is Dulce Sloan. She's a comedian. She's on the Daily Show sometimes. And she was playing God in this particular bit. And, she was saying, yeah, they were bragging, someone bragged, God himself couldn't sink the Titanic. And her response is, oh, what about these icebergs though, right? And the word though at the end of that sentence is kind of a cue phrase. It's saying like, it wasn't necessary, but it's really useful for communicating some side channel information. The side channel information she's communicating is, a little bit of power, of course, but also like a generational component, right? This is not something that Gen Xers like me would say. It's clearly a millennial thing. So we looked at the cue phrases in Switchboard, and what do you know? There's a generational effect. People use the word, people who are using the word actually were born, like, I think this is about 1940s, give or take. People use the word like. So this is the 40s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So people born in the 60s and 70s use the word like way too much. That's my generation. Like, and anyway has like a weird distribution. Each one of these is showing like a very generational distribution. The word so was in favor, it came back in favor, it stopped. And then, Gen Xers started using it a lot more. So we see a lot of things happening with cue phrases. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. I'm using this as a shameless plug. We do research like this in the Magix lab. We're going to start having our meetings, I think, a week from today for the fall semester. Please join us. Please reach out to me if you're interested in this or any other projects that we do in machine learning or big data. So we're doing quantum criticism, looking at bias in news media. We're looking at wildfire prediction. We're looking at a bunch of different things. And that's all I wanted to say. So in summary, our ASR systems underperform because they learn the central dialect. Language may be too coarse a dividing line for modeling variation. We can look at regions, but we can also look at smaller chunks, generations, for example. When we do that, we see that there's performance in our speech systems. And we should maybe start looking at other phenomena, like sociolinguistics, actually. We can get to it a little bit through this kind of analysis. All right, I'm done. Any questions? I think Sarah said that Dulce Sloan is awesome. She totally is. All right.
If people are afraid of unmuting themselves, you're welcome to also use the chat.
I just have a quick question. Like, I'm pretty new for machine learning. I just want to know, when you're training the data, did you categorize the data? Like, maybe this like audio is from the standard English pronunciation, or another one is from maybe Chinese people or Indian people. So did you like will generate like different model for different accents people?
So, so what I described is actually not just one experiment. I described about 15 different. You know, I should count, but there are a bunch of different experiments. So I started by talking about my friend Guo Zinan, his speech samples. They actually came from, you know, I'm not sure I can disclose where they're from, but it's from a bunch of people who were actually speaking to a real system. So that was one set of experiments that we did. I specifically labeled all of that data. So there were Native American, you know, L1 English American speakers. And there were a few Chinese speakers, and there was one speaker, I think, from India and one from Scotland. So there were a bunch of different speech samples in the database that I was using. In the other ones, for example, in Switchboard, the speech was, the speakers were tagged for the region that they came from, but I found there were a number of errors. So one person who claimed that, you know, who was tagged as being from Texas said, yeah, but I went to school in, you know, Maryland, but really I'm from Boston, that's where I grew up. So there's some definite errors in the labels for some of the speech in there. ABI and IVIE less so, but ABI had, the British Corpus had some errors in that they were looking for people with what they call strong accents, and they were often unable to find people to meet their criteria, and so they kind of fudged it at some point as well. So we by and large had labels for some things and not for other things, but we you know, generally did. We generally knew whether people were native English speakers or not, which region they came from, and you know, the other things varied from corpus to corpus.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question. So can you talk about potential applications on processing accents?
Yeah. So one of them, you know, one of the things that people are looking, one of the things that people have used, at least linguists for, is called LADO. So it's language analysis for the determination of origin. So there's a longer story, but let's say someone shows up and makes an asylum claim in the US and says, you know, I come from, you know, a particular part of the world. I come from, you know, East Timor or, you know, somewhere. Essentially, a linguist is pulled in, someone who, you know, is you know, good at, you know, knowing things about East Timor, including their language. Someone is pulled in and then, you know, listens to this person speak and then makes a determination. Yes, this person is from this place. So there are a couple components to it. You know, you have to know the place geopolitically. So you have to know current events and things like that. You also have to like speak the language and understand cultural references really well. So one of the things that we can do is automate a little part of that. Say, yes, this person is indeed from, you know, is using an East Timorese, you know, dialect or whatever. So that's one of the applications. In addition to, of course, just like regular speech recognition. And it's a nice parlor trick. So one of the things that I would like to do in the Magics Lab is determine whether someone is faking that. So can you tell, you know, Trevor Noah always does like an Australian accent, for example. Can you tell that Trevor Noah is not actually speaking with a native Australian accent, even though he's really good? You know, can you tell that he's really a South African? So a couple different examples like that.
That's very cool. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I hope this was useful.
Well, thank you, Professor Brizan.
Thanks.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, I was just like filling the sonic space.
Well, we really appreciate you taking time to present. And as Professor Brizan said, he'll be sending out information, or they'll be having their first meeting about their first meeting in the Magics Lab next week. And maybe if you want to send me information, I could distribute it to students about if they wanted to be more involved. I'll follow up with you afterwards.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or evening, depending on where you are. I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.